Hello, and welcome to the Structuralist theoretical critical review of The Truman Show. Structuralism is a theory that came out of actually two other theories. The new critics believed that they were looking for theme. So if they were dealing with a story, if they were dealing with a film, if they were dealing with a novel, the theme and how you get there is the most important thing. Formalists believe that they wanted to take a look at how the form of the thing was made is the most important. Structuralists take it one step further. They're looking at how the individual building blocks can be compared to others. For example, here you have what essentially amounts to a very simple house. There's a door, 4 walls, a roof, and a ceiling, and a floor, and a window. Great. So the new critics would say, well, what's the purpose behind this house? What's the thematic element of this house? What are we trying to get across here? The formalists would say, well, it has house-like features, so let's take a look at those. Structuralists take it one step further. They say, well, has anybody noticed that all of the houses have 4 walls, and ceilings, and floors, and windows and doors? And take a look, most of the pieces are the same color. I wonder why that is. I bet if we were to compare and contrast all the different parts and pieces that make up storytelling, we'd be able to make sense of it all. And that's exactly what they did. So how does this apply to The Truman Show? Well, let's start off with the basics. Anton Chekhov, the playwright, although not technically a structuralist, did contribute a little bit to it because he knew that there were certain structural rules that theater and storytelling had in common. One that he dealt with was the idea of the fact that most stories could be divided into 3. Maybe not exactly thirds, but pretty darn close. His argument was that the first third of any story was about the initial crisis, things starting to pick up, things starting to develop. Basically from the point of the initial moment of action until about the turning point, the point of no return when the story can't go any further. The second third is what he referred to as rising action. Conflicts that built so that they were leading somewhere. The stakes were getting higher and higher and higher. The final third came down to the climax and the resolution. How do all of these things amount? What exactly is happening that allows for the story to be divided up in such even thirds? Let's take a look. In The Truman Show, which is 96 minutes long runtime if you cut out the credits, what you have are 3 sections. The first section, you're introduced to Truman. Actually, the very first thing is a very documentary opening, but we'll talk about that in a second. But almost within the first 5 minutes of the film, Truman, seen here, almost has a lamp fall on his head. That is the initial action. Once that occurs, everything sets in motion. It is something out of the ordinary, even though he does not technically lead an ordinary life. From the moment that that happens until he stops all traffic, and that very dramatic music starts to play. That is the crisis point. That is the point of no return. That is exactly 32 minutes, which is exactly 1/3 of the runtime of the film. The next 2/3 is where you have a situation in which all of the events are occurring. That includes the chasing down his wife in the operating room, taking her on the wild goose chase and being cut off left, right, and center. Having more and more moments in which things just seem out of place and out of the ordinary. The moment that it stops is the moment that Christoph is introduced more formally, and all of a sudden we go to the moon. Guess when that happens? At 64 minutes. Exactly 2/3 of the runtime. The last third involves the showdown between Truman trying to escape and having the Christoph trying to stop him. And this takes the last 32 minutes of the film. By the end of the story, you have Your resolution. Kristoff loses. As far as we know, Truman escapes. Perfect thirds, exactly like Chekhov predicted. Another structuralist aspect that we need to focus on is the idea of fairy tales. A lot of the original structuralists noticed that it was the fairy tales that had very similar patterns, very similar what are called tropes or conceits that repeated themselves throughout history, throughout time, from culture to culture. If we were to look at the Truman Show as a fairy tale, there are a couple things that we have. One, we do technically have a bad guy. We have Truman, who is our hero. We have a romantic interest, so let's consider her the princess character, for lack of a better term. We have a strong suspicion that by the end of the story, that we know that he is going to wind up with the princess and leave Meryl behind. We know that he and Meryl are not going to survive. We know that there are going to be trials and tribulations, and we know that eventually, due to his tenacity and spirit, that Truman is going to succeed. These genre expectations involved with fairy tales play a pretty important role. Then the question lies, of course, is the idea of how do we get there? If we all know that it's going to have a happy ending, if we all know that it's going to build and sustain itself like a fairy tale, we know that eventually it's going to end in a joyous way, or at least a triumphant way. The question then lies when, how do we get there? Another aspect that's involved with structuralism is the idea of why. Why are all of these stories so similar? Why are these structures and patterns so commonplace? There are three different answers for that as far as we can tell. The first deals with the idea that storytelling serves a particular purpose, which is it has to resolve our issues with regards to what are referred to as binary opposites, paradoxes that we cannot solve. Life versus death, freedom versus safety, privacy versus our public lives, that which is entertaining to us, but that which may be oppressive to others. All of those elements can never perfectly be resolved in real life. So we watch stories so that there's some sense of a resolution, some sense of a satisfying ending. The second element has to do with our collective unconscious. Jung, who is a psychoanalyst who came from and studied under Freud, believed that what there was a collective unconscious. In all humanity, for the thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of years that people have been around, there are certain fears, certain desires, and certain aspects that have all kind of sunk into what he called our collective unconscious. That means that there were certain archetypes, certain characters that repeated themselves in stories again and again, certain story patterns, certain objects, all of them representing, almost like universal symbols, that everybody can relate to. It's the reason why, if you compare fairy tales from 3,000 years ago to today, or if you look at something like The Hero's Journey, which we can talk about a bit later, there is that idea of the fact that there is such a familiar pattern to it, because underneath it all human beings have something driving them that's the same. Talk about archetypes. Our good friend Truman here, at times, plays the fool, he plays the romantic lead, and he plays the hero. All three archetypes that Jung talked about. Meryl, represented here, and I do apologize for the TIE Fighter outfit. It was either that or Chewbacca. She represents the witch. And yes, you can believe it, feminist literary critical theorists do not like a lot of these archetypes. You have Sylvia as the romantic lead, the princess, the maiden, someone who needs to be rescued. Although, technically, one would argue that she rescues him in trying to break him free of his solitude, trying to break him free of his illusion. Kristoff, at times, represents both the wise old man and the villain. The third reason why has to do with ideology. The argument is the notion that ideology is an important aspect. It's the voice and the powerful force behind culture in order to get people to do one thing and to avoid something else. This film kind of plays with that in a very interesting way. The town of Sea Haven is a representation of an America that never existed. It only plays I Love Lucy and classic old films. It's so pastoral and peaceful and reminiscent of a bygone era. an era that technically did not exist. Everything is very calm and quiet and orderly. The wife does work, but she wears an old-fashioned nurse's outfit. She also does all the cooking and talks a lot about having babies. Truman, the man of the house, mows lawns. Yes, he is dressed like a clown most of the time that he's doing it, but at its core, he's still expected to follow a particular role. That's when you have a situation in which, if you have somebody like Sylvia or Lauren interrupting, and you have the control system coming in place as they desperately try to force these two together and these two apart. Why? Because at its core, they're trying to control the chemistry. They're trying to control the reason why. Ideology is being supported. Now, this also begs the question, because we're dealing with something that we haven't even talked about yet, which is that he's being watched. We see the audience, not to mention that we are an audience watching the audience. All of that to say is that if we are hoping that ideology, the dominant ideology, can get usurped, and the subversive ideology can take its place, and these guys are on the outs, we cheer. We cheer because the music tells us to. But remember, we've also seen moments in which all those things have been contrived, made up. We all know the reality of reality TV is not that real. We know that they're structured moments. We know that they're edited. We even have the two guards complaining about the fact that you never get to watch the two characters have sex. It's just soft, peaceful music and wind through the curtains and the breezes, and it's all very, very structured. The reason it's structured is because that's the fairy tale that people are being fed. Even though Truman is trying to live a real life and is unaware of anything that happens to him until the moment of this movie, at its core, Truman is representing an ideological fairy tale of what everybody is insisting that people do. Everyone needs to be like Truman. Unfortunately, Truman usurps that. He overthrows. He escapes. He defies conventions and does everything he can, and that's the reason why people watch. So here's a question for you. What genre of movie is this? Structuralist focused a lot on genre expectations, looking at that formula between that which we expect and that which surprises us, and that delicate balance of getting it right. So what is this? A comedy? An adventure story? A romantic story? If you think about it too deeply, it could be quite a terrifying psychological thriller. The notion of that level of control, that great of an illusion, in order to support millions of people watching, just because we want that moment of reality, even though technically nothing is real. Think about it this way. Structurally speaking, you have Truman, who is living his real life, while everyone around him acts. When all of a sudden it's revealed that it's an illusion, Truman tries to get people to stop acting. All the while, it's attracting more and more audience, more and more of a reaction, more and more of a public in order to be able to see what's taking place. As well, by the time you're done and Truman is planning his escape, he's acting and all of the other actors are technically being real. There is that breakaway moment when all of a sudden he looks straight into the camera, his best friend, and says he's gone, and they have to cut transmission. All the while in this story, Structuralists would say that all the elements of a fairy tale are here, but the problem is the fact that there's an ingredient that's missing. That ingredient that's missing is the notion of the fact that he has an audience, and we are an audience watching that audience watch Truman. Every one of those moments, those fairy tale elements, the build, the rising climax, the car chase, the confrontation, the betrayal, and the reveals are all being sold to us the way that we've all enjoyed our stories for so long. At the end of the movie, we all have a little bit of a moment of could I say dissatisfaction? Could I say that things are disrupted? Could I say that things are off kilter or a little out of whack? Because from a structuralist perspective, everything has been turned askew. Everything has been turned on its side for a little bit. We're not getting a traditional fairy tale here. We're getting something a little bit different.